Hey everybody, it is me, Corrie Sommers, and today I'm joined with Brandon, and we're going to be discussing some new changes that have passed in Southern California, well actually all of California, regarding rent control and how this might impact you. So stay tuned. All right, so today, Brandon, we're here to talk about the changes in legislation that affect rent control. And what does that mean for homeowners that are renting out their property?
Right. It's definitely a big topic because now they're making it statewide. Before it was always city by city. And so that's how landlords, investors have always been kind of directing their efforts and where they're going to place money. So now that it's become statewide, I think it's going to have some effects. Something to think about, that's for sure. One thing in particular that I've already noticed is there's been a lot of transactions where the investment property owners are currently in their 1031 period. So that means they've already sold their property and they have that time period to identify new property. And the interesting part is all these efforts are going out of state. So I spoke to a person who runs, he's like an accommodator, and so he speaks to a lot of these investors. And for the most part, I think it's just a lot of uncertainty about the future of what rent control is going to do in California, LA in particular, overall. So just by uncertainty, just by itself, these certain group of owners are already taking their money because the market is actually doing so great, they can maximize what they're going to get now. And then they're going to start looking at a state where there's not as many rules, rent control issues to deal with. So we'll see what happens there.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, general rent control, the way it is and the way that legislation has been passing is you can't increase it more than 5% per year, correct?
Correct.
And I know even for me, as someone who owns property, I tend to not increase the rent every year, just because like I know how tough it is when you're renting and you're on fixed incomes.
True.
But usually like 2 to 3 years in, I will do some sort of an increase, and I never do 5% ever.
It's pretty high. It's pretty high.
It's high.
I agree.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
And it feels like, because I think back to when I rented in the 90s in Los Angeles, I didn't get rental increases every year either.
No,
we rarely got a rental increase. And now it seems that every year there's like a 5, a 10, an 8% increase.
Right.
And it kind of reminds me, and I almost hesitate to say this, but back in the 2000s when loans were just like, if you had a pulse, here's money. It's kind of like the same type of attitude. If we own property, we're going to keep going for the blood and keep raising and raising and raising because we. So I would imagine like anytime government tries to get involved, it's to create a solution to something that's becoming a big problem, and sometimes it helps, a lot of times it doesn't. So to kind of prevent this constant increase year over year that's just gotten outrageous, they've capped it. But let's talk about those other implications.
Yeah. I think the way investors think is they look at a property and they look at the potential, and before rent control, they always thought they should be able to get the tenant out. It's just a question of how much effort they put into it, technique, and probably how much they're going to pay the tenant to move. And so that's why they're used to paying a certain amount. But in the new bill that they've passed, it basically says that the landlord has to have just cause. So now it's not going to be so easy for them to get a tenant out. And so I think it's going to have them really rethinking it, and it's protecting the tenant overall, because I've seen and heard of, some basically become victims of these circumstances. So I think that's going to all help the tenant, not so much maybe help the landlords.
Right, so where you have maybe some of these bigger conglomerates buying apartment buildings that were smaller investors who maybe owned, a couple of homes and 1 or 2 apartment buildings, and now they're being bought out and gobbled up by these big corporations who really look at the bottom line and will come in and say, okay, current market rents for a 2-bedroom is $2,500. And we've got a couple, 30 people in this building who are paying $1,500. We need to get them up.
Right. You're right.
So this will prevent them from that accelerated step.
I think it's maybe going to more personalize what investment properties are, and they're homes that people live. their renters because they cannot afford to own yet. So these big companies that you're talking about, they treat it like an Excel sheet. It's purely numbers to them. So I think this is going to get them to rethink, hopefully, about how, they're going to spend their money and what's, in everyone's best interests. It's pretty interesting stuff.
What does this mean for someone like you and I that have owned just a couple homes or a couple condos that we rent out because we're in the business and as we're trying to step into a nicer and bigger home for ourselves, we're also building up retirement portfolio?
Absolutely. And just like you, I have, like a condo, I've just been happy to rent out with a quality tenant and not so focused on raising the rents.
Agreed.
So I see the value in that. The good news is, regarding this rent control bill, it does not affect single family and condos as long as you keep that in your name as an individual. But once that property is in an entity, and we know most investors will protect themselves by owning as an LLC, that actually does subject the property to rent control. So what we're going to probably see are a lot of those properties held in LLCs or corporations transferred into individual names. So that's kind of interesting because the purpose of an LLC is to protect yourself, but you can't have it, 100% your way if you're an investor owner in this town.
But let's think about that for a second.
Right.
So it'll prohibit them from the way you would evict somebody or terminate tenancy. But either way, if the property is in your name or in an entity's name, you really can't go beyond the 5%.
Right.
So unless you are someone that's really planning to aggressively evict, you still could keep it in an LLC or something like that for that layer of protection or trust or whatever. Right.
And, a house or a condo is just one door as opposed to like an apartment building. Right. So if you have a high-paying tenant, there's no need to make any changes because you're just getting good rent. So you can keep it in your entity or LLC. But, if you are dealing with a long-time tenant that you've not increased their rent and you don't necessarily want them there for the long haul, then maybe that's where you do move it back into your individual name and it won't be subject to rent control.
Okay. There's that too. And then, of course, when we're talking about the subject of issues with tenants or eviction, I'm a firm believer that if I'm going to evict somebody, if it's gotten to that point, they have been failing to pay the rent, they're not working with me, they're being deliberately delinquent, then I'm hiring an attorney. I'm not getting involved in the process like that. We're just going to go to court and we'll let the judge sort it out. Right. So I think that's just kind of something important to touch on. Yeah. And I think also, because you had originally sent an email to me today about this subject, which is why we're talking.
Yeah, it's important stuff.
And there's some properties that will be exempt, and if I'm saying anything incorrectly, please just step in. But properties that are less than 15 years old are exempt from the rent control. Properties that have more stringent local rent control laws, like we all know Santa Monica has rent control.
Very, very strict.
Of course, we mentioned the single families, condos, townhomes. A duplex, I think this is interesting. A duplex if the owner owns and lives in one of the units, which is always a great way to kind of step up. Maybe you've bought a condo, now it's time. You want more of a yard, so you get a duplex, you've got a tenant, it's helping to pay the mortgage, and then your next step is going to be into that home. So those are also exempt, which is pretty good.
Yeah. And work for the city or rent control. I'm a investment property owner like yourself, and I do work in the title and real estate business, so I'm aware of a lot of these changes. But what I will say is these things are going to be subject to change. I think it's such a big bill that passed. There'll probably be some, modifications to it along the way. So that's probably what's making some investors just get out because they already see that coming. So I would stay tuned to that for sure.
Yeah. And so to just kind of recap too, the bill that we're talking about that is passed regarding rent control is, in case you want to go and Google this, it's titled AB 1482. AB 1482.
A Senate Assembly Bill, AB 1482.
Yeah. So, and of course, I'll also include a little bit of links below so that you can do some research as well. So someone that really might be thinking this might affect me too much, and I don't know if I should hold on to my rental properties.
Right.
Who does that person look like most?
I think out-of-state owners who are not here to pay attention to everything happening, but they're just sitting on a nice property collecting rent. I think since they've been collecting rent for a good amount of time with a lot of property appreciation, now seeing that we're kind of, I would say at the peak of the market, maybe a little past the peak, I would think now is the best time to take advantage of what you can get for that property, and then look in other growth areas, whether it's out of LA County or out of state, because you keep hearing about other states that have growth happening, and see where you can take advantage of those markets. Yeah,
and that's not a bad idea. No. I mean, people in various states are complaining that we in Southern California, or Californians as a whole, are driving up the cost of living because
Californians
selling homes here and moving on to retire in Idaho,
right.
and it's upsetting the locals.
Yeah.
So, I mean, your home is one of your biggest assets, and it is something that really, if you make it work for you, can really help you in retirement. And that's a whole different subject, but we just want to give you some of the brief updates of what's happening here in California regarding rent control and legislation. And Brendan, I really appreciate you taking some time to catch up with me today so that we can share this information. And everybody, if you've not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, as always, I just want to encourage you and invite you to subscribe, click the bell for updates, and I'll see you next time.